Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 6th of September, and in today's concise update, we're looking at the Russian capture of Sich. We'll look at their advances towards the vertical portion of the border between Donetsk and Dnipro. We'll discuss events and things that have gone under the radar to the northeast of Pokrovsk. We'll discuss what's going on to the south of Severis, along with the Serbianski forest, the Kupansk front, and we'll finish off with the village of Unikivka in the Sunumi direction. So let's zoom in over here and look at this advance by the Russian side, which has now been verified based on reporting from the Ukrainian side, but also based on a video released from the 31st Mechanized Brigade, one of the stables of the Ukraine's defense over here in the region between the Dnipro and Donetsk border. So over here, they released this footage, and it's from today, of their targeting of Russian motorcyclists, armored vehicles, and infantry. There was at least one armored vehicle that I saw was, I believe, an MTLB. So those Russian armored assets were pushing from the eastern direction for the most part along Vosrosenko, because once they consolidated control over there, it became a large breeding ground for forward infantry squads. And then from there, they started pushing towards Sich within the past couple of days. So the way in which this village was captured unfolded in two ways. First of all, we had the fall of Pavilka and Voronezh. So you had this very strong vector, which was led at the helm by the 336th Brigade. So that included the capture of Voronezh, and then from there, the storming of Novoselivka from the south. And then a couple of days ago, and especially within the past 24 hours, we've received information from deep states that the Russian side has been able to bypass Sich. And so they advanced from Vosrosenko and then took control over some fortified posts along the border, and then some of the tree lines and ravines that are directly flanking Sich from the north. And so this awkward situation was created wherein the Ukrainians were no longer in control of Novoselivka, no longer in control of many of the tree lines north of Sich, but that is very narrow corridor through some of the open fields via which they were able to retain control over the village, but it was in an extremely exposed position. And so by that point, they were essentially squeezed out, and the Russian side was able to enter directly into the village. And you did see in the footage from the 31st Brigade that there were several motorcyclists involved in the rapid storming of the village, and then from there, seeping into the basement and taking it over. So now the front line has sort of strengthened for the Russian side because they have this wider salient. Novoselivka on its own was a narrower bulge that the Russians had control over, but now this salient into Dnipro Oblast and all the way up to the Vovcha River spans about 4 kilometers in the vertical direction, meaning that the Russian side now has the necessary linchpin needed to attack towards Shandryholove. First of all, we have this outstretched salient wherein the Ukrainians continue to resist just north of Vosrosenko. That's an area that's certainly exposed and also does distract the Ukrainians from the main objectives of, for instance, retaining control over the Vovcha River line or holding on to Shandryholove. And moreover, now that the Russian side has been able to take over Sich, it's not going to be that much of a stretch for the same garrison to now attack northwards. And so you're going to see assaults potentially coming in from the eastern direction, the same area that the Russians were pushed out of, and then an additional prong from the southern axis, meaning that the Ukrainians will have to stave off offensives from two directions in an area that is really difficult to resupply, because you have over here Shandryholove, and to the west you have the Vovcha River, and then there is this large forested area, and not only does it span the entirety of the western bank of the river, but it's also extremely dense. So in this particular area, it's about 11 square kilometers before you arrive at another river, the Pavilka River. And so you also have to traverse that river and then another forested patch before reaching a key supply hub like Veliki or to the north you have Havrylivka. But again, really far away from the line of contact in Shandryholove. And you also have to traverse several layers of bodies of water and tree lines. And even though on my map I have Zeleny High and Andrivka Klovtsove as at least being partially under Ukrainian control, over the past few days, and this has been going, again, under the radar, but the Russian side has been able to gradually change course and reverse many of Ukraine's gains that were spearheaded by the, for instance, Up 4 Battalion, which is over here on the map, or the 5th Heavy Mechanized Brigade, or perhaps even the 37th Marine Brigade, and then some of the main intelligence directorate units. Now, a lot of those gains have been reversed, but it's going on in a gradual manner with DRGs just pushing forward, taking over tree lines or open fields in the direction of Andriyivka, Klevtsove, and some Russian sources have already alleged that they've taken back all of the Ukrainian possessions to the east of the Vovcha River. That's certainly premature because we have over here 19 square kilometers of territory that the Ukrainians took back during those counterattacks, in addition to all the other chunks of territory that we see over here within this corner. And this is still within the context of Donetsk Oblast. So these regions that are not necessarily well defended, but they do contain some tree lines on either bank of the river, are also locations that the Russians never touched, even at their zenith over here. And so there's no indication that they've taken them over now. But certainly, I would say that the gray zone is probably larger than I'm depicting over here on the map, so we'll have to look at it into more detail. But that also means, and why I'm mentioning this now, is that there's no way for the Ukrainians to really increase the connectivity with Alexanderhrad through Andriyivka, Klevtsove, or Zeleny High, because those regions are already dealing with their own issues. Even crossing over the river and entering into these villages is difficult on a daily basis. So forget about then moving even further southwards at a minimum 8 kilometers southwards to resupply an isolated node over here. And that's why the dynamics are certainly unfavorable for the Ukrainians that continue to defend within this hamlet, which is why I expect it to be next on the chopping block. At the same time, though, we do know that a lot of Russian sources are alleging that Khoroshia has fallen into their hands and that Sosnivka is now within a gray zone due to back and forth clashes. Again, something that's not verified, but certainly directionally, you could see how the Russians would want to take over Sosnivka for several reasons. And I think we've covered it before, but I'll just reiterate once again that there is a possibility to then hijack this paved road to advance southwards and cut off Turnove and Brezhove, and then also use that same paved route, which is actually pretty close to Novoselivka. And so there's already a basis for this to then combine forces and then assault towards at least Orestopil on the southern bank of the river, and potentially even Veliki Komikhalivka, at which point the Ukrainian garrison on the other side of either the Vovcha or Kamyanka rivers would be more exposed. But there is also this large countryside and vast swaths of open fields to the south that can also be exploited with the intention of eventually arriving in an area like Pokrovske, or at the, over here it's Hachor River, or Haichor River, I should say, and also to flank the second line of defenses that is meant to protect Zaporozhye from the north. So those are all long-term possibilities, but the dynamics are favorable to Russia in this area simply due to the fact that, yet again, the Ukrainian line over here has not been beefed up in recent days. There was a beefing up a couple of weeks ago with the introduction of at least one battalion of the 225th Assault Regiment. We saw, more involvement from units like the 110th Mechanized Brigade and 31st Brigade's been always present around here, so they may need some sort of rotation at this point due to combat fatigue. Whereas the Russian side, they're attacking with the 37th Brigade, 36th, they've been heavily involved in some of the recent gains. 336th, as we said, pushing towards Verona. 57th, pushing from the south. They took over Zaporizhzhia, so they can be involved yet again in overrunning villages near the second line of defense as opposed to protect Zaporozhye. So yeah, certainly an area with a lot of possibilities, which is why I always focus on it. It's one of the locations the Russians continue investing in, continue capitalizing upon. Over here, south of Moskovka, the Russians have taken over 3.11 square kilometers of territory, and some Russian sources allege that the advances are even larger than I depict over here, that they basically arrived at the southern outskirts of Moskovka. Moskovka being the final village fully under Ukrainian control in this corner that from there would serve as an access point towards some important fortified nodes, and then the northeastern entrance to Novopavlivka. You have this paved road that you see over here on the map, through which you can cross over the outer ring of the town. There are two, what appears to be, at least from what I discern, at least two sort of outer rings that are supposed to defend Novopavlivka in a fortified manner with organized trenches. And there's also the Solana River that runs through the northern outskirts. And so it's a difficult area to assault, but certainly it's an option, one of several that can be used to divert Ukrainian attention away at any given time. And this all occurs within the backdrop of back and forth clashes in Dakhni. I know that some Russian sources claim that the Ukrainians counterattacked over there, then the Russians pushed them out. So there's certainly a degree of fighting over here right now, with the intention of then paving the way for an assault from the south towards Pavilka. But it seems as if the Russians have recently shifted their focus towards clearing out this northeastern approach, at the very least, in order to divert Ukrainian attention away from other axes, or perhaps to even use it to facilitate attacks from a new direction. Because, again, we already have the eastern direction and the one from the south. The gaps between the line of contact and the perimeter of Novopavlivka are extensive in those areas, even if they're not fortified, meaning that drone coverage is going to be the best route of defense that the Ukrainians can end up taking. But it is slightly smaller, I would say, the gap between some of the fortified positions and some of the outskirts of Novopavlivka and, say, an area like Muravka. So that's perhaps some of the thinking as well. The Russians just want to expand their horizon over there. Moving on, though, let's look at a bit of an update from the area north of Murad, because we do have a bit of a discussion about what actually constitutes the line of contact over here. So we know that the Ukrainians did conduct several localized counterattacks within the past week or week and a half, and were able to reestablish control over much of Nikhanorivka. But at the same time, there is a lot of sentinel imagery or fires from the NASA firms maps that indicates that there may be some clashes either in Dorozhny or even further westwards near the approaches of Belitske. The problem is there are 0 pieces of footage being released from the Ukrainian side of any sort of drone drops or FPV strikes onto Russian forces over here. And likewise, the Russians aren't going to send any sort of proof that their DRGs are operating in these locations, meaning there's a massive information vacuum. And then from there, we're just left to surmise based off of reporting without any geolocations to back it up, which is why I'm being very cautious with this. But I want to just mention this so you guys are informed. But there is a strong possibility that, yes, perhaps Nikhanorivka is still contested, but that the Russians have control over areas in or near the Dorozhny rail station, including the windbreaks to the south, and then from there use these positions as a route by which to approach the eastern outskirts or even northeastern outskirts of Belitske and try to enter into the private residential areas along that perimeter. So you can zoom in over here and see which areas I'm referring to. And I just say this because there's, for the entirety of the week, been imagery of fires, of craters that have been created along this particular micro district within Belitske. And so that could be Russian shelling of Ukrainian forward positions, or it could even be Ukraine shelling Russian DRGs that are approaching these locations. That's not necessarily clear, which is why I'm not changing the map. But we should just keep in mind that these areas are private residential areas, the apartment complexes that are extremely condensed and then also compact as a result, difficult to overrun. They're a bit to the west. And that's where the Ukrainians that are holding out in this town are mainly situated, meaning that there is an opportunity for any DRGs to try to seep in from these locations over here, perhaps enter into a basement and then hide and evade Ukraine's fire. That's some of the rationale behind the DRG's movement. And in these areas, they're conducting these sort of attacks in groups of 3 to 4 at this point. That's been the general norm. So again, something to keep an eye out for. At the same time, we do have new fires just to the southeast of Novoshakhove, so there does appear to be a heightened degree of Russian activity over here, perhaps because they're trying to get control over this Hektova Balka Park region. It's an area where there are a couple of dugouts and tree lines that are important, and it would probably be a part of an initiative to ensure that the Ukrainians are no longer present in Nikhanorivka. The Ukrainians over here, they have a pretty strong garrison, 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade, 12th Azov National Guard Brigade also present around here and involved in the counterattacks along with the 4th Rubizh Brigade. So they've been the forces involved in a lot of these fluid assaults, trying to hold back DRGs, trying to obtain control over Belitske, whereas the garrisons in Rodinske are a bit different. You have the 14th National Guard Brigade and 38th Brigade. And then a bit to the south, we had a new video released today from the 79th Air Assault Brigade of their FPVs destroying 4 or 5 armored vehicles based on the footage as they were approaching from Malanivka. So it appears that there's been a new route adopted by the Russian side from Malanivka. then across to Mirlyubivka, trying to then perhaps take this route in between Mirlyubivka and Mykolaievka in one particular region where the Ukrainian counterattacks have not been focused. So it's a very narrow route. And then from there, they try to break out into the large, expansive fields that are to the east of Mirnarod, trying to dismount forces at the outskirts in order to create a breakthrough-like scenario where the Ukrainians can no longer afford to send their forward assets to locations like the Terets River or to the southeastern outskirts of the town of Novoekonomichny. So these assaults are being conducted by the 5th Oplot Motor Rifle Brigade. They are, the insignia is pretty much clear on the tanks or armored vehicles that are being utilized. So that's the main Russian offensive force within this new salient that we've seen form over here. And again, as I said before, they're being combated by the 503rd Marine Battalion or by the 79th Air Assault Brigade. Looking at the developments south of Severis, the Russian side has been able to capture what amounts to 1.4 square kilometers, and I'm being be conservative with my estimates. A lot of Russian sources have talked about this recently, Divgen, Radov, etc., about the Russian forces pushing from Rozdolivka and shoring off control over every single Ukrainian possession to the east of the Bakhmutovka River, and including the capture of Perizhny. Although I'm not sure of that, I would have to see a larger body of evidence before making that sort of change, because for a while now, at least one of the battalions of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, perhaps even the 108th, has been involved in holding out over there. But certainly when we look at these houses that are in this liminal area between Fedorivka and Perizhny, they've been taken over by the Russian side. And the same thing would go for all of the trenches built nearby, and also some of these either windbreaks, because there's a rail station over here, or just the shrubbery that's growing around the Bakhmutovka River. All of those positions have been taken over by the Russians recently, and there may have also been crossings to the west of the Bakhmutovka River. After all, it's rather narrow, but I'm going to refrain from making a definitive statement about that. But that's pretty much it when it comes to the Severis front. A bit to the north, though, this is interesting. We have further Russian advances to squeeze the Ukrainians out of the Serbianski forest. But yet again, it's coming from a vertical direction, not horizontally. So the Ukrainians are still extremely stretched out in this particular location. They are, I would say, from Yampil. Let's take the easternmost outskirts of Yampil. The Ukrainians are about 14 kilometers away from them when you look at their forwardmost positions within the Serbianski forest. So that's an extremely thin line to retain control over. It's very susceptible to being cut off from a weak point like this over here. You can see there is actually some sort of populated area or some sort of dacha region within the forest over there. And then it's about 1.5 kilometers before you actually cut off the entirety of the forest from that one Russian point. So based on updates from Deep State, we can say that the Ukrainians, or rather the Russians, have captured 3.15 square kilometers of territory. And this largely consists of the forested areas to the north of some of these small lakes. And these are the areas that were probably the least, I would say, solid for the Ukrainians, because, of course, the main Ukrainian DRGs, or the main forces that retain control over these areas, they are focused around the core, where you have just this completely just tree-filled, tree-infested area. Maybe there are some fortifications, but it's mainly just trees and not many bodies of water. And so it's just a more unified location. It's more cohesive. And then having to traverse the rivers or traversing the lakes over here, and then moving northwards to another location where there's a forested area, it just becomes difficult as the Russian strain continues to tighten their noose over this particular location. And so the Russians just took over control over all of the possessions north of these various lakes that connect to one another. And this can be repeated. There are a lot of other locations north of lakes where the Ukrainians are still present, but perhaps it's becoming more thin and perhaps more difficult for them to hold out over there. So we can see the same thing about this area. There are also some smaller rivers or tributaries or such that are located in between the Ukrainian front line and I would say quote unquote rear. It's not really a rear over here, such as this one that I've outlined with these red lines. So again, there's a lot of room for exploiting the geography here by the Russian side, and it's going to be difficult for the Ukrainians to continue holding out. As we look at this over here, between the line of contact and the Donetsk River, if we're being generous, it's about 2 kilometers at most. And then at the sort of smallest extent, it's only about 800 meters. So this is becoming very quickly a fire bag, especially in areas where there's not foliage and it's easy to spot the Ukrainians. And the 53rd Mechanized and perhaps even the 54th may be involved in the movement over there. Actually, not the 54th, but rather the 119th TF Brigade and perhaps a couple of other nearby separate battalions. But that's pretty much it for the Serbianski Forest. Let's move on. There is this very interesting video that was released today by the 3rd Army Corps. So the 3rd Army Corps, as we all know, its area of responsibility has tended to be further northwards because of course, 3rd Assault Brigade Azov, which is the mother of the entire Army Corps, perhaps the senior most unit, I would say, the one that is, first of all, the largest in terms of size. The Ukrainians claim it has 10,000 men. I don't know if that's true, but it certainly has more than its counterparts in the Army Corps. And they have been present for the most part in locations that are a bit further north, defending this sort of crescent-shaped formation that's supposed to absorb attacks in the direction of Borova. But now it appears as if some of their resources, including the tank company, have been moved southwards to engage with the advancing Russian forces with the intention of preventing an assault towards Lyman. So over here, at a minimum, because I'm being very generous when it comes to like the Ukrainian losses over here, I'm not going to show that they lost control over all the nearby fields, but the Russians at least took control over 2.27 square kilometers of territory. And then in the southwestwards direction, they captured about 3.5 kilometers, or were able to advance to that degree. And that includes advancing along this paved road that you see over here. And then from there, branching out along Volitsia, Huchenka. And this is a concern because the Russians have at least partially cut off the road connectivity between Shandryholove and then Drobysheve and Lyman by extension. And so this gives the Russians on their end the opportunity to squeeze the Ukrainians out of this salient that is formed over here in between Shandryholove, the nearby extensions via ravines, and then the outstretched part that is the southwest of Zelena Dolina. This entire region is now extremely exposed because the Russians already have a strong base along the northern outskirts of Shandryholove. They've recently been able to advance south of Zelena Dolina, take over key heights, take over some tree lines, and now have been able to push towards the eastern outskirts of Novoselivka. And so there is just excess location that the Russians have evaded and have been able to isolate as a result, and that is centered around Shandryholove. The Ukrainians likely invested most of their resources in trying to prevent the frontal assault, but were surprised with this sort of southeastern hook coming in from the rear. And as a result, this now creates a conundrum for the Ukrainians as they try to retain control over this town, Shandryholove, because it can be used perhaps as a sort of buffer between the line of contact and Lyman. But that sort of utility is now diminished as long as the Russians can retain control over this yellow polygon, because from there, they can push westwards towards Novoselivka and create issues over there, including taking it over or taking over some of the road networks that are leading in and out of it. But at least for now, the key sort of headline is that the Russians have been able to reach this Huchenka road. The problem is now they can use this, and after consolidation, of course, but the directional sort of utility would be that they can now advance southeastwards along a paved road and arrive at Drobysheve, and that would have to be addressed, of course. Taking it over is certainly going to be difficult. It's a rather large town. But then from there, it's just open season, and you're able to actually evade some of the major fortifications that are meant to surround Lyman by advancing along this road. And then you could arrive at the northwestern outskirts of Lyman. So certainly there is a vision over here when it comes to why the Russians are attacking in that particular direction. And we have this geolocation to back it up. 2 tanks from the 3rd Army Corps fired onto Russian positions east of Novoselivka. And the footage shows that there's another video, which is from August 29th, I believe. So it's been over a week now. But there was a Russian a Vandal FPV drone. That's what it's called. It's a Vandal FPV drone because it has fiber optics. And so it struck a Ukrainian tank that was operating around the same location. So I don't know if it's a separate incident or if it's related. But regardless, it does show that the Ukrainians have tried to beef up their tank companies in this region. They already have tanks engaged in fighting around Zarichny and now around Novoselivka as well. So certainly an area to keep an eye out for, because this could be used in exploitation as a sort of stepping stone to begin attacks northwest of Lyman. At the same time, some Russian sources claim that they've been able to cut off this sort of semicircle shaped road in between Drobyshev and Zarichny. It's called Volitsia Horkoho, I should say. And so some Russian sources claim that they've been able to cut them off along this particular tree line. I don't know if that's true, but we'll keep an eye out for that, because certainly over the past couple of days or weeks, the Russians have been able to advance north of that purported region where the Russians were able to break through, and that would be around Kolodyazi. So there is some level of Russian activity over there. Now, to move on, I want to zoom in on Kupansk because we do have a slight advance. The Russians have taken over the entirety of this northwestern road in Moskovka. It amounts to about 0.5 square kilometers of territory. I don't know the name of the road. It's not written over here, but it runs just to the south of the Kupanka River. And this just shows that the Russians are strengthening their base within the village. That will be used in all likelihood to then push across a broader axis towards the northwestern outskirts of Kupiansk and taking over those private residential areas, because this has been an area that I would say the Russians have put the most emphasis on. Yes, there are DRGs pushing along the river itself, but the advances over there are not as concrete as the ones from the northwest. So it appears as if the Russians are just strengthening their operating base in that direction. Now, to finish off, I want to look at Sumy. We do have a bit of a refresher when it comes to the order of battle over there, because I haven't looked at it for a while. The main Ukrainian forces defending in the direction of Yunakivka would be the 156th Mechanized Brigade, along with the 80th and 95th Air Assault Brigades. And you can see them over here on the map. 71st Eager Brigade is generally involved in the fighting around Oleksivka, Novomikhalovka, Andrivka, Verashina, this entire direction. And then you have one battalion of the 225th Regiment that may be operating in this location. In between, you have the 1st Heavy Mechanized Brigade, and there are a couple of other units like the Steel Border National Guard Brigade units. I think it's the 15th Brigade. And you also have the 5th Sumy Border Detachment, and other notable units in this region, if I can find their logo, but I know they're somewhere over here. So when it comes to the recent Russian advances, they've been able to take over nearly all of Yunakivka. So within this southern part of the village, they captured about 1.23 square kilometers. And then to the east, they captured about 4.65 square kilometers, including the warehouses in running along the northeastern outskirts, as you can see them over here. They took over some of the forested plantations just to the south of Yunakivka, where you do have some small inlets that are located, some small bodies of water. So those are other positions that could have been, had the Ukrainians drag out their fighting over there. They could have had some degree of fortified positions in those locations, but regardless, the Russians took them over. There are some kernels of resistance, for instance, this gray zone over here, because you have an outstretched Ukrainian position along one of these final roads in Yunakivka. And same thing over here, there are a couple of houses where the Ukrainians continue to resist, but it is a gray zone, and the Russians are working to just fully clear it out. And at the same time, these fields to the northeast of Yunakivka have also fallen into Russian hands, as the Ukrainians try to fall back to this massive forested area to the north of Sadki, and this is where they're going to try to stabilize the front line to prevent any sort of Russian push in that direction. But that should never have been the Ukrainian concern with the fall of Yunakivka. And the Ukrainians did understand the utility of Yunakivka. That's why they've been able to drag out the fighting over here for so long. But at this point, as we're reaching the final stage of the battle, the concern will be, even though, yes, the Russians have significantly degraded their garrison in Sumy, so the chances of anything significant happening are lower. But with the forces that are still over here, they've been able to push deeper into Yunakivka. So there's still a threat to a certain degree. And they can now turn their attention southwestwards towards the highway over here that runs from Hrapishina, or rather Hrapvishina, and then from there towards a whole host of other villages that are along this second line of defense in Sumy that we've been talking about so much, that the Ukrainians have succeeded in defending due to attacking northwards and retaking villages like Andrivka and Kindrativka. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.